In the aftermath of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, Netherlands counted among the forefront countries which responded to the international humanitarian calls to help Rwanda overcome an unprecedented post-catastrophe crisis. Like many other international players on the ground at that time, the Netherlands, through direct bilateral aid and by way of multilateral support mechanisms, committed enormous resources to help Rwanda rise from its ashes. This was the period of implementation of the emergency assistance programs. The decision by the Dutch government for a prompt humanitarian intervention should be commended. Rwandans were in a bad need of urgent support after going through a despicable genocide nightmare. In November 2001, the Dutch Parliament decided to include Rwanda in the group of eligible recipient countries having the right to benefit from regular Dutch development cooperation. Arguably, that decision was essentially motivated by the requirement for reconstruction of vital institutions of a country which had nearly lost most of its important socio-economic infrastructures during the genocide.
Later, in 2003, four Dutch NGOs, Cordaid, ICCO, Kirkenakti and Novib, conducted a joint national assessment of development progress in Rwanda. It was followed by the publication of its important findings alongside practical recommendations charting the way forward. Based on the reports, general remarks and calls were voiced demanding for aid freeze from the Dutch cooperation. It was recommended to stop any Dutch humanitarian assistance and development cooperation. It could only be resumed under the condition of establishing a fair justice, especially by carrying out independent investigations into the disappearance of 5 people in early 2003, among whom there were key political figures blacklisted as opponents to the ruling Rwanda Patriotic Front (RPF). Besides, it was further suggested to condition the release of Dutch aid on credible explanations by the government of Rwanda regarding allegations by a UN team pinpointing the role Rwanda had played in the illegal exploitation and plundering of natural resources in the eastern region of the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. The joint NGO's paper was a 62-page monitoring report of activities carried out in Rwanda over that period. It was entitled "Tell Our Government It Is Okay to Be Criticized," and it was released on the 10th of February 2003 in The Hague. The report provides a comprehensive account of the benchmark criteria guiding the evaluation exercise, as well as the required recommendations that should be implemented in order to make aid possible in a context conducive to an effective development process. After 2003, we are compelled to stare the reality in the face, the NGOs declared in a joint statement introducing the report. As this report will show, space for political debate has nearly disappeared and a climate of fear, abuse of power and exclusion is now dominating in Rwanda, they added. The report also sounded an alarm urging the Dutch government to be coherent with the Rwandan government by consistently challenging its stance with regards to the systematic violations of human rights violations and other red flags of the tightening of political power. The dialogue needs to be more regular and stricter, the report read as one of the proposed recommendations. Based on the Dutch NGO's joint report's revelations, one may be entitled to assert that the Dutch government had embarked on funding a regime showing early signs of slipping onto a politically oppressive tread.
11th of March 2005, the government of Rwanda and the government of Netherlands signed a Memorandum of Understanding, MO, which set out the roadmap for development partnership and provided a framework for mutual dialogue and accountability. Strikingly, none of the critical issues pointed out in the Dutch NGO's joint report could be taken into consideration. In contrast, the Dutch government turned a blind eye to the report's allegations and pumped in more money, thus further helping to consolidate and strengthen the institutions of an oppressive regime. The second multi-annual strategic plan of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, for Rwanda, covered the years 2008 to 2011. The total portfolio budget allocated to Rwanda operations amounted €137 million. It should be revealed that the initial budgeted amount for the General Budget Support Program for the year 2008 to 2009 was significantly less, that is, only €7 million. According to a publication in the Reuters newspaper of 12th of July 2012, a spokesperson for the Dutch Foreign Ministry announced she had suspended €5 million in aid the Dutch bilateral cooperation agency originally reserved to improving Rwanda's judicial system. She however clarified that the support mechanism to non-governmental organizations based in Rwanda would not be affected by the decision.
In stunning twist, 3 weeks later the Dutch ambassador to Rwanda, Frans Matken, announced that contrary to media reports, his government had not suspended aid to Rwanda because there was no aid due for disbursement. Ambassador Frans Matken clarified this after bidding farewell to President Kagame, after his tour of duty had come to an end. Until today, it is still puzzling to understand how an ambassador could dare publicly contradict an official declaration by the foreign desk in The Hague from which he receives orders. For which reasons? Could one surmise it could be because the Kagame person is so terrifying the ambassador couldn't afford to face him angry? Dutch ambassador to Rwanda also made the following observations. What happened is that the Dutch government decided that it will not make any decision on aid until Rwanda pronounces itself on the UN accusations. We think that Rwanda has made an extremely serious response that has satisfied us. Rwanda has been serious and open about everything and has been seen to be keen on finding a solution, and we think that things might change in the coming weeks. Obviously, this was a twisted declaration. Once again, that was also not true, because nothing changed. There could be only one plausible explanation. Either The Hague was not satisfied by the Rwanda response to accusations of fueling conflicts in DRC, illegal resource exploitation, and spoliation, as reported by the UN, or there was another justification. After the donor community unanimously suspended aid to Rwanda as a condemnation of the pervasive presence of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, the Dutch government presumably did not want to remain the only donor government continuing to provide the budget support to a beleaguered country.
From that time onward, Dutch aid reactivated the sector budget support. According to the Dutch Ministry for Development Cooperation, the support was streamlined for the rehabilitation of the justice sector through institutional capacity building of the Rwandan Ministry of Justice. The capacity building framework covered both the training and overhead costs, such as payment of salaries of the civil servants. It was a strategic action aimed at maintaining and enabling the local capacity to compete effectively with more profitable economic sectors. One important component of the project concerned reinforcing the rural police. It was designed to enable the government of Rwanda manage to enforce law and order as well as combat impunity. The penitentiary sector also benefited a portion of the Dutch aid. In this regard, a genocide fugitive tracking unit could also manage to run operations thanks to the Dutch taxpayers' money. Its role is to track suspects accused of crimes of genocide. Meanwhile, alongside the Dutch government's sustained support to Rwanda, numerous special reports as well as annual reports by international human rights organizations were released, all unequivocally pointing to the anti-democratic practices and human rights abuses increasingly becoming a new established norm in Rwanda. Among the organizations that sounded the alarm you find the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders, Freedom House, Committee to Protect Journalists, and many others. The donor community governments have been consistently notified of what was going on in Rwanda. Moreover, U.S. State Department and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom reports on human rights situation in Rwanda have also consistently confirming the general positions of the previous Dutch NGOs' reports and in many cases coming with new insights purporting to realities worse than previously recorded. Several consistent reports unanimously pointed out the following issues. Freedom of speech and media nearly inexistent. Political space and dissident voices systematically suppressed. Abuse of power by law enforcement forces have become a norm. Widespread fear in the general population. Lack of independence of the judiciary, with systematic obstruction of the justice system by state organs.
In line with the previous assertions, for example, the country report produced by the U.S. Department of State Human Rights in 2020 on the state of the human rights in Rwanda is quite revealing. It read as follows: outcomes in high-profile genocide, security, and politically sensitive cases appeared predetermined. Some lawyers were reluctant to work on politically sensitive cases, fearing harassment and threats by government officials, including monitoring of their communications. State security forces continued to coerce suspects into confessing guilt in security-related cases. Judges tended to accept confessions obtained through torture despite defendants' protests, and failed to order investigations when defendants alleged torture during their trial. The judiciary sometimes held security-related terrorism and high-profile political trials in closed chambers. Some defense attorneys in these cases reported irregularities and complained judges tended to disregard the rights of the accused when hearings were not held publicly. Some opposition leaders and government critics faced indictment under broadly applied charges of genocide incitement, genocide denial, inciting insurrection or rebellion, or attempting to overthrow the government. The previous year, in 2019, the U.S. State Department on Human Rights report had released the following unsparing declaration: Rwanda security forces regularly arrested and detained persons arbitrarily and without due process. The law provides for the right of persons to challenge in court the lawfulness of their arrest or detention. However, few tried, and there were no reports of any detainees succeeding in obtaining prompt release or compensation for unlawful detention. Then each report produced each year from 2013 onwards added up gruesome details that are both shocking and painful to read. Most particular with regards to allegations of unfair trials with political motivated charges. Amnesty International reported them extensively as part of organization's yearly reports since 2000. To this end, resourceful information database is readily available for public consultation. However, I would not recommend anyone with an extreme sensible heart to read them, for their revelations are painstakingly repulsive.
By comparing randomly any of the most recent reports with the early 2000 report compiled by the 4 Dutch NGOs calling for the end of support to Rwanda due to human rights violations, you simply realize that the level of human rights abuses in Rwanda has increased exponentially since that time. Moreover, in many cases methods used to both conceal and cover up malpractices have equally been increasingly sophisticated. One of the methods utilized includes the use of relentless fear-mongering, terrorizing and imprisonment of political opponents on fabricated claims, most of which come in the form of politically motivated charges. For example, across last 3 presidential elections, held in 2003, 2010 and 2017, for each presidential run-up won by the incumbent President Paul Kagame, most of the presidential candidate hopefuls were either arrested or incarcerated. Elsewhere, the leader of opposition political party would be beheaded. The arrest of Dr. Theoneste Niyitegeka in 2003, Victoire Umahosa in 2010 and Diane Rwigara in 2017 remain the most memorable examples of political repression in the history of Rwanda. It's in this perspective that André Kagwa was beheaded in 2010. To make matters worse, cases involving assassinations, disappearance, and abductions of political opponents both inside and outside of Rwanda have been dramatically increasing. Along the process, Rwanda became the only African country in history known to extremely engage in aggressive manhunt, kidnapping and assassination of its exiled political opponents and critics outside of its borders. Accordingly, cases of assassinations and assassination attempts have been recorded in Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Mozambique, Cameroon, Belgium, and United Kingdom. Equally, situations of kidnapping have been recorded in Uganda, Zambia, UAE, Kenya, Mozambique, and Comoros. Fortunately enough, most of the abduction, assassination, and assassination attempt operations, be it in Rwanda or outside of it, have been well recorded and published and openly disseminated for the wider public knowledge.
Among cases the likes of the previous ones, it's worth highlighting the peculiar kidnapping situation of the most recent and high-profile kidnapping operation. Indisputably, it remains to a large extent the most outstanding abduction case to date and a living demonstration of how oppressive regimes won't spare any means to violate the rights of whom they suspect as a number one threat to their regime. It's about the kidnapping of Paul Rusesabagina from in the United Arab Emirates in August 2020. History shall remember Rusesabagina as mythical figure in the history of Rwanda for having inspired an Oscar-nominated movie Hotel Rwanda. As a matter of fact, the Hotel Rwanda movie narrative is based on his real-life story events, when he was an acting manager of a hotel in Rwanda when the April 1994 genocide took place. The movie recounts his heroic actions to save lives of Tutsi families inside the hotel he was in charge of. Then on a fateful day, he was trapped, abducted from the United Arab Emirates, and forcefully flown back to Rwanda without realizing what was going on. Once in Rwanda, after many days of illegal detention, he was brought before justice where he was found with 9 counts of charges, among which terrorism and conspiracy to start an armed group. Once Paul Rusesabagina was under Rwandan police custody, Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, hastened to publicly condemn Paul Rusesabagina, alleging he was indeed guilty of the charges. Wasn't this a conspicuous demonstration of blatant obstruction of justice? In fact, with such a declaration, one may easily assert that they effectively obliterated his right to be presumed innocent. Rwandan Justice Minister Johnston Busingye admitted in an interview with Al Jazeera in February 2021 that the government had paid for the private jet used to carry out the kidnapping operation. It should be recalled that Kigali organized his kidnapping after the international arrest warrant issued against him had been disregarded by both the Belgian and American authorities. It had been rejected because it lacked substance and rather carried a hallmark of political motivation. After a number of judiciary hearings, Rusesabagina announced that he would not attend any trial processes going forward, explaining that there was no way he could expect fair justice from the judiciary proceedings. His international lawyers were prohibited to come to Rwanda, and the only one who was allowed to enter was deported few days after his arrival. On the 11th of February 2021, the European Parliament adopted a resolution, which was endorsed by the majority of Dutch members sitting in the European Parliament. It had 15 points, which summarized the European Parliament positioning on the above-mentioned matter in Rwanda. Among the adopted resolution, you could read: the European Parliament condemns the enforced disappearance, illegal rendition, and incommunicado detention of Paul Rusesabagina. Urges the Rwandan authorities to ensure the separation of administrative, legislative, and judicial powers, in particular the independence of the judiciary. On the 20th of September 2021, Paul Rusesabagina was sentenced to 25 years in jail. In a response to the Rwanda judiciary condemnation of Rusesabagina, the European Parliament adopted a new resolution on the 5th of October 2021. Like the previous resolution adopted last February, it was also endorsed by the majority of Dutch members sitting in the European Parliament. A total of 15 points were formulated to summarize the European Parliament positioning on the Rusesabagina case, as part of general appeal towards the Rwandan government to sanitize its political space and judiciary system by guaranteeing fundamental human rights. Parts of the resolutions formulated read as follows: the European Parliament strongly condemns the arrest, illegal detaining, and conviction of Rusesabagina, which violates international and local standards. Considers the case of Paul Rusesabagina to be an element of a wider Rwandan policy focusing on the silencing of persons critical of the regime. Calls for the immediate and unconditional release of Rusesabagina and the immediate release of the rest of the other prisoners of conscience. Denounces the Rwandan authorities' restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms and the arbitrary use of pretrial detention for repressing dissent. Deplores the overall human rights situation in Rwanda, and in particular the targeted persecution of dissenting voices and the closure of the democratic space. Deeply concerned by the use of the criminal justice system in a manner which erodes confidence in the judiciary.
Among many existing cases relating to restrictions of the political space and oppression of critics, a particularly vocal political case which in addition is closely linked to the Netherlands is worth sharing with you. It involves Ms. Victoire Umahosa, who was a Rwandan woman living in the Netherlands, before she decided to leave all behind including her family and career, to return to Rwanda in January 2010. She intended to get involved in the political transformation of her country. Once in the country, she followed all formality procedures required for registration of a political party. She planned to contend for the 2010 presidential elections. Her dreams were instantly foiled because she was later arrested and imprisoned. In September 2012, Ms. Umahosa, while in prison, she was nominated as a potential beneficiary by the European Parliament of the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. She was later sentenced to 8 years in prison. Daniel Bekele, director for Africa in the Rights Watch at that time, made the following remarks: "The courts should not be used for such political purposes," before adding, "Several factors lead us to conclude that Ingabire did not receive a fair trial. They include the politically motivated charges, such as genocide ideology, doubts about the reliability of some of the evidence, senior government officials' public statements before the trial about Ingabire's guilt, and broader concerns about the lack of independence of the Rwandan judiciary in politicized cases." The Amnesty International, which followed the trial, closely reported that despite international scrutiny, the trial was marred by violations of due process. The court failed to test evidence brought by the prosecution. Confessions of two co-accused incriminating Victoire Umahosa were made after a prolonged period of detention in a military camp, where Amnesty International has documented allegations of the use of torture to coerce confessions. A defense witness claimed he had been held in military detention with one of the co-accused and alleged that the individual's confession had been forced. On 6 October 2016, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on the case of Victoire Umahosa. Among other points, the resolution strongly condemned politically motivated trials, the prosecution of political opponents, and the prejudging of the outcome of the trial. Most of Dutch members of the European Parliament supported the resolution. On 24 November 2017, the African Court on Human and People's Rights held that Rwanda violated Victoire Umahosa's right to freedom of opinion and expression as well as her right to adequate defense. For the African Court, the criminal conviction and sentence imposed on Ingabire for her speech, incurring charges of minimizing the genocide, was a disproportional and unnecessary restriction on her freedom of speech. However, the court further found that the law criminalizing the minimization of genocide may impose a legitimate restriction on the right to freedom of expression, for purposes of preserving public order and national security.
Among many existing cases of assassinations, the killing of a high-profile military and political figure that occurred in South Africa on the 1st of January 2014 is worth sharing with you. Colonel Patrick Karegeya was the former head of Rwanda External Intelligence Services. He later fell out with the Rwandan regime, and he was illegally incarcerated twice in Rwanda before exiling to South Africa in 2007. In April 2019, the South African police made a public announcement that criminal investigation reports concluded that the suspects in the murder of Colonel Karegeya and other several assassination attempts could be directly linked to the involvement of the Rwandan government. On the 17th of February 2020, a popular Rwandan gospel singer and reconciliation activist, Kizito Mihigo, was found dead in his police detention cell. The official police notice claimed that he had committed suicide, and the police denied any independent investigation into the causes of his death. Most presumably, it's highly likely he was slain by the legal enforcement forces. As a matter of fact, there was a precedent to the Kizito death. In one of his songs, Kizito praised the merits of commemorating the killings from both sides. He emphasized the importance of honoring all the victims of the past Rwandan tragedies, without segregating the ones that fell under the current regime forces. For late Kizito, it was the only way true and sustainable reconciliation could be reached. More importantly, it would help create an environment where learning from the past could be possible, thus helping to avoid falling back into the traps of the Rwandan dark history. In all likelihood, it looks like President Kagame was infuriated by the singer's stance on reconciliation and commemoration matters. Merely because in Rwanda, there's a tacit norm prohibiting anyone from ever referring to killings orchestrated by the current regime. On the 25th of September 2020, being a first of its kind in history, Kizito Mihigo became the first person to be awarded a posthumous Vaclav Havel Prize for Creative Dissent. It is an international award that celebrates artists working under extremely restrictive conditions. All the previous narratives provides a well-documented track record of what one can learn about the government of Rwanda in relation to delivery of justice, rule of law, human rights, freedom of expression, and assembly, as well as political space over the past 20 years.
To sum up, here are the key characteristics of the country's justice institutions as well as law enforcement agencies, which were heavily funded to the tune of millions of euros by the Dutch taxpayers. Use of torture to coerce confessions. Restrictions of fundamental rights and freedoms. Enforced disappearance and illegal rendition. Violation of international and local legal standards. Stoking climate of fear. Politically motivated trials. Systematic abuse of power. Hijacking courts to serve political interests. Kidnapping of political opponents. Assassination and assassination attempt of political opponents. Manhunt of vocal political and activist figures living in exile. Despite the above grim picture, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Kigali could not shy at making a public declaration such as the following. The Dutch added value in the justice, reconciliation, law and order sector is recognized by all stakeholders. On the government of Rwanda side, there is satisfaction with the long-lasting support which has moved from successful projects in the past to sector budget support. Honestly, what kind of value addition did the embassy help create? As things stand, and based on our previous narrative presentation, it is clearly not a positive one. By all accounts, it would not be overstatement to assert with great confidence that the Dutch taxpayers' money has been an important funding component, used in strengthening the roots of oppression in Rwanda. In addition to the Dutch empowerment of judiciary and law enforcement agencies the Dutch government has taken an extra mile, by collaborating in extradition of people wanted by the Rwandan government justice system allegedly due to their direct involvement in the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis. We have investigated cases of those who have been already extradited and those who are still fighting the extradition. We discovered unbelievable, shocking and revolting facts in relation to the Dutch government's shameful behavior when faced with the extradition requests from Rwanda. We have also uncovered unbelievable facts about appalling legal process that those extradited are forced to go through in the presence of indifferent eyes of Dutch officials.
Let us start with those who have already been extradited to Rwanda. Luckily, it is important to note that meanwhile Dutch authorities have hired International Commission of Jurists, ICJ, Kenya section, to monitor the trials ongoing and the handling of cases already extradited to Rwanda. On September 25, 2013, the Rwandan authorities addressed a request to their Dutch counterparts, requiring extraditing Mr. Jean-Claude Iyamiremye to Rwanda, so he could be convicted for his alleged involvement in the 1994 Rwanda genocide. Therefore, most of the information shared with you regarding these cases was fetched from reports regularly published by the ICJ monitors. All related information is publicly available at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. With regards to Mr. Iyamiremye's case, the Dutch Supreme Court ruled that there were no justifiable reasons not to extradite him to Rwanda. It invoked a previously held settlement by a lower district court, which had concluded that extradition to Rwanda would not violate his fair trial rights. Consequently, the accused was extradited to Rwanda and arrived in Kigali on November 12, 2016. Strangely enough, a defense counsel given to him in Rwanda to assist him throughout the court's proceedings constantly advised him to plead guilty for all charges. When the defendant rejected his advice, the counsel reached out to his family and attempted to use them convince Mr. Iyamiremye to plead guilty so he could attract a lesser sentence. Against this backdrop, Iyamiremye ended up hiring a new defense counsel. The material used by the prosecution to indict Mr. Iyamiremye supposedly came from the conclusions of Rwandan popular justice courts, which had earlier tried him in absentia. According to them, the verdict had concluded to 19 years in prison. Rwandan community justice courts are the infamous Rwandan grassroots community court, generally known in Rwanda as the Gacaca popular courts. The 19-year court's sentence would be effective from 2007. According to available and reliable sources, Mr. Iyamiremye had at several occasions requested to be shown such indictment evidence records, especially after his extradition to Rwanda. But all attempts to secure them were to no avail. Therefore, the only most reasonable explanation is that those records simply did not exist. Against this backdrop, one can most presumably surmise that during the extradition hearing of Mr. Iyamiremye, in the Netherlands, Rwanda justice authorities based their indictment on fabricated claims, falsely alleging he had already been sentenced by a community court 10 years ago. It came as no surprise when during his trial the court also found out that the prosecution witness testimonies indeed presented many contradictions. However, the court concluded that the weight of testimonial discrepancies was in no way strong enough to result in making void and cancellation of all the testimonies. Despite that the indictment charges appeared inconclusive, the court ruled that the accused had effectively been involved in the Kicukiro Nyanza assault on Tutsi simply based on accusations, quite difficult to falsify, that the accused had indeed been seen there. More importantly, there's a reasonable modulating factor we expect could have convinced the Supreme Court in Netherlands to withhold the final ruling to extradite Mr. Iyamiremye, at least until further serious incriminating material was presented. It is the point that none of the witnesses present could unequivocally admit having seen Mr. Iyamiremye killing anybody in Kicukiro. However, quite shockingly, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison on the 30th of June 2021.
The second case involves the trial and extradition of Mr. Jean-Baptiste Mugimba. Earlier on 22nd of November 2012, the Rwandan prosecutor's office requested the Dutch authorities to extradite Mr. Jean-Baptiste Mugimba to stand a trial in Rwanda for alleged crimes of genocide in Rwanda. At the end of the judgment of the 20th of December 2013, the Extradition Division of The Hague District Court upheld his extradition. Mugimba arrived in Kigali on the 12th of November 2016. During the trial, one prosecution witness admitted before the court that he had been forced to sign his confession by the Rwandan prosecution. This was powerful evidence appealing for rejection of the witness statements during the trial. The witness further revealed that he had to lie to the prosecution to save his life because he was under pressure and had been threatened by an officer from the Witness Protection Unit as well as by members of the prosecution team. Following this, the prosecution requested the court to adjourn the hearing, defending they were dealing with a hostile witness, and this required them to reconsider aside the issues raised by their own witness. An incident of this kind reminds of typical scam trial processes. When ICJ monitors visited Mr. Mugimba in prison on the 23rd of August, 2018, he requested them to follow up his trial process through linking with the Dutch embassy in Kigali so they could ensure that all their reports about his trial proceedings are posted on the website of Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Obviously, Mr. Mugimba wanted to use a publicized trial as a strategy to alert people from the Dutch ministry and any other relevant Dutch authority about the injustice he was undergoing. In later hearing, the prosecution witness who happened to be a prisoner revealed that, when he refused to enter a forged testimony deal, the Rwandan penitentiary officers beat him so much that his ears got seriously infected to the extent pus was leaking from them. When one defense lawyer asked him whether his allegations could be certified by medical professional, the witness said that the medical report could be found at the Nyanza prison clinic. During the hearing of the 22nd of May 2020, the prosecution submitted an application requesting to amend the two previously raised criminal charges, complicity in genocide and conspiracy to commit genocide. The defense of Mr. Mugimba appealed against the amendment proposal and instead requested the court to dismiss the statements of the persecution witness altogether because his statements contradicted each other. The second testimony nullified the first declaration previously presented before the community-based Gacaca trials rendered in 2006. The trial of Mr. Mugimba came to an end just recently. The decision of the court is expected to be rendered on 23rd of December 2021. Until now we have been dealing with cases of people already extradited to Rwanda. Let us now delve into those cases of people still grappling to prevent the Dutch judiciary from treating their extradition cases in a similar way like they did for their countrymen.
The case of Charles Ndiraihi. In March 2009, Charles Ndiraihi was arrested in what looked like a routine highway control in Netherlands and detained right away. The next day, when the public prosecutor inquired about his criminal file from Interpol, it turned out to be empty, which prompted his immediate release. On the 8th of September 2020, he was rearrested on the basis of a new Rwandese arrest warrant. For this time, after diligent interrogations, the public prosecutor released him after 16 hours of arrest. It turned out the Dutch Immigration and Naturalization Service had misinformed, hence tricked the public prosecutor into issuing an arrest warrant in a way that violated Dutch legislation. In fact, local laws provide that no Dutch national could be extradited to Rwanda. Shortly after the arrest of Charles Ndiraihi, the Executive Secretary of the National Commission for the Fight Against Genocide, Dr. Jean Damascene Bizimana, told a local newspaper, The New Times, which is regarded by many as a Rwandan government mouthpiece, that Mr. Ndiraihi had been arrested following an arrest warrant issued on April 20, 2010. He further specified the warrant provided the foundations on the basis of which he could part of the Interpol wanted list of fugitives. These remarks by a Rwandan senior executive are quite troublesome to many respects. 1. How come the arrest warrant information regarding Mistandiraihi was issued by Dr. Bizimana in lieu and place of the relevant desk from the prosecutor's Genocide Fugitive Tracking Unity? 2. If Rwanda had requested the Interpol to issue a red notice against Mistandiraihi in 2010, how come his arrest by the Dutch police could take place 1 year before, 2009? It defies logic to understand how the Dutch police could invoke an Interpol red notice in 2009, at a time the Rwandan prosecution had not yet launched it. 3. Mistandiraihi carried out his political and campaigning activities in broad daylight, without ever having to hide where he lived in the Netherlands. He was actively and publicly involved in political activities of the Rwandan opposition diaspora. Why did the Rwanda prosecution authorities have to go through the Interpol mechanism, while they had the leeway to deal directly with the Dutch judiciary authorities to request for his arrest? It should further be noted that from the time of his arrest in 2009 onwards, Mistandiraihi legally challenged the judiciary procedures through which the Interpol red notice had been issued and courts ruled in his favor. He has now been removed from the list of wanted criminals by the Interpol. Very recently, on the 10th of November 2021, Just Security org reported about the growing concerns from inside the U.S. Congress regarding to the increasingly alarming rise in transnational repression. More specifically, their concerns point to the systematic abuse of Interpol mechanism by certain member countries, which take advantage of it by using it to serve reprehensible political objectives. Like using the Interpol as an instrument to track and punish members of opposition or dissent. One may wonder whether it's just simple coincidence that Rwanda tops among countries abusing the Interpol mechanism. In all likelihood, the Mistandiraihi case may quite reasonably have sounded the alarm, thus calling the attention of the U.S. Congress, which might have led them into further scrutinizing malpractices, such as the Rwandan regime abuse of the Interpol services. Notwithstanding that the Interpol cleared Mistandiraihi as a wanted international fugitive, and in spite of the previous revelation about both shortcomings and vulnerability of the Interpol, the Dutch authorities have remained adamant with regards to the arrest warrant issued by Rwanda authorities. Shockingly enough, the extradition process into his case is still ongoing.
The case of Damascene Rugomboka. Mr. Damascene Rugomboka is a Rwandan opposition activist based in the Netherlands. He is accused by the Rwandan government to be among top planners of the Rwandan genocide. More specifically, the collaboration in creation of lists of targeted Tutsis living in the Kigali capital is among other charges weighing over his head. Although, it is important to clarify that, during the time of the events, he was residing in Gisenyi, currently a northwestern province located at a few hundred kilometers from the Kigali city. At a closer look, the indictment case of Mr. Damascene Rugomboka looks quite puzzling. Being accused by Rwanda as a high-profile genocide executive the caliber of top genocide masterminds, one may be allowed to wonder why he never appeared on any list of top genocide planners like former ministers or other high-ranked military officers, and that for all 18 years. More importantly, 5 years after official end of the Gacaca popular community courts. As things stand, the case of Rugomboka remains such a judiciary conundrum that is yet to be resolved.
The case of Mr. Joseph Mugenzi. On the 14th of January 2013, the Dutch Law Enforcement Authority received from Rwanda prosecution authorities legal documents requesting the arrest and the extradition of Mr. Joseph Mugenzi. Rwanda indicted him for various counts of criminal charges closely related to crimes of genocide. The documents indicting him had been signed 1 month earlier by the then Rwandan General Prosecutor, Mr. Martin Ngoga. The content of the indictment documents used to incriminate Mr. Joseph Mugenzi before Dutch laws is completely stupefying. As matter of fact, the Rwandan prosecution alleged Mr. Mugenzi played a critical role in leading, planning, organizing, and in execution of the 1994 genocide in the Nyamirambo and Nyakabanda sectors in the Kigali capital in collaboration with Mr. John Baptiste Mugimba, whom we mentioned earlier, and who was extradited to Rwanda by the Dutch authorities. As you undertake a deeper analysis of Mr. Mugenzi's accusation material, you come across a number of dubious and utterly questionable points. Below we share with you the most striking ones among them. 1. The name of his parent is wrong. How come an authority failed to accurately designate the identity of the person of such importance under investigation? 2. The prosecutor claimed that Mr. Joseph Mugenzi was a banker and worked for the National Bank and owned a pharmacy as a side business activity. But the truth is Mr. Joseph Mugenzi has never been a banker in his life, and according to him banking was not even a sector he had ever considered as a career choice. What the prosecution failed to present with great accuracy is that Mr. Joseph Mugenzi had indeed been a pharmacist working in the private sector. He had previously been a researcher and a lecturer at the National University in Rwanda in Pharmacy and Chemistry Department. Once again, it's unfathomable how prosecution authorities miserably fail to correctly identify such a caliber complete identity. 3. The indictment also alleged that both Mr. Mugenzi and Mr. Mugimba had ordered the killing of someone named Dr. Emmanuel while failing to provide details of his family name. We hold the view that there is no way judiciary authorities can fail to locate and identify such person as important as a medical doctor at a community level. 4. Reading across the indictment material, you find claims that Mr. Mugenzi, alongside his colleague and neighbor Mr. Mugimba, participated in the genocide planning meetings. We believe these are complete baseless lies due to the following reasons. Mr. Mugimba was not and had never lived in the same neighborhood with Mugenzi. Mr. Mugenzi had never met Mugimba before they met for the first time in the Netherlands as they attended Rwandan community diaspora social activities. Mr. Mugenzi had never been a colleague of Mugimba, who was a banker at the National Bank of Rwanda, BNR. During the entire Mr. Mugimba trial, which only came to end of recent in Rwanda, Mr. Mugenzi had never been mentioned among people who participated in that meeting. Which leads us to the clue of the puzzling question as to why the Rwandan prosecution had to make up the Mugenzi case in the way they did it. In fact, it's conceivable that at the time of fabricating elements to indict him, they realized that it could be much more interesting and trustworthy for the Dutch authorities if they could slip into the forged Mr. Mugenzi criminal profile elements that helped to link both Mr. Mugenzi and Mr. Mugimba together. As such, like his co-accused Mr. Mugimba, Mr. Mugenzi was falsely branded as a banker too. Furthermore, to make it look like a simple naturally occurring event, they included that both were neighbors. The cooking of criminal cases by the Rwandan Prosecution Bureau grew in sophistication as a result of the previous experiences in close partnership with the Dutch judiciary system. Rwanda had grown to learn that they could create any kind of well-elaborate criminal profile as they pleased, provided that the forged crimes look extremely serious, logical and easy to buy in. Because they knew the Dutch would rarely question those facts. In 2014, a Dutch investigative journalist, Aniek Verbreken, became very intrigued by the increasing number of genocide suspects living in the Netherlands. Then she decided to go to Rwanda for ample field investigations. Once in Rwanda, she discovered that the Dutch embassy in Kigali had committed an independent investigator to gather the most reliable information on Mr. Mugenzi's past life, while looking in particular at all possible facts likely to serve as indisputable evidence of his participation in the genocide. The Dutch embassy wanted to seriously cross-check the information that had been provided by the Rwandan prosecution services. In a report submitted to the Dutch embassy in Kigali, the investigator confirmed that Mr. Mugenzi had been just a pharmacist and had never been a banker. He also confirmed that there was no single established evidence of his participation in the Rwanda genocide. While studying biographical information about his alleged victims, the investigator discovered that there were no such victims, but people whose lives were saved thanks to his heroic and risk-taking actions. To substantiate his conclusions, the independent investigator met some of those Mr. Joseph Mugenzi saved and collected statements from them. Among the survivors there is a child, with whom Mr. Joseph Mugenzi had rescued, while he had multiple and life-threatening injuries caused by machetes. Mr. Joseph Mugenzi carried him to the southern part of Rwanda, at the Butare University Hospital where he worked 6 years earlier. Mr. Joseph Mugenzi then ensured that the child obtained the critically needed care and treatment by the medical staff, most of whom were former colleagues, and made sure that the child's surviving extended family members living closest to the area would soon attend to him. The first immediate reaction by the Kigali Dutch embassy before such a report is quite embarrassing if you bear in mind, it's the embassy which had commissioned it. Once it was released, they denied its existence. But later, on the 16th of May 2014, one Mr. Mugenzi's counsel in the Netherlands, Mr. Jan Hofdijk, inquired why that report could not be used as supportive evidence during the Mr. Mugenzi court hearings at the IND part of Ministry of Justice and Security. This opened the gate allowing IND to inquiring into the conclusions of the report carefully sealed in the offices of the Dutch embassy in Kigali. In a letter dated the 11th of June 2014 addressed to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs wrote, "The investigation report on Joseph Mugenzi was not sent to The Hague, because it had provided insufficient useful information. For this reason, the report has not been shared by the embassy with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in The Hague. Until today, that report is still tucked and tightly sealed somewhere in the back office drawers of the Dutch embassy in Kigali." Above all, the most shocking element of it all about Mr. Joseph Mugenzi case is that he was included on the list of the wanted genocide fugitives only as late as after 2014. Therefore, it's totally unsettling as one wonders why it took as much longer as 20 years after the genocide to indict a person supposedly responsible of high genocide crimes. Definitely, there's something fishy about the Mugenzi case. So no wonder that what's going on with this case is totally appalling. The previous situation rings a bell with observations of a senior UN officer regarding respect of fundamental rights in Rwanda. A quote in a report that shall remain memorable by Maina Kiai, once a UN special rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association, could read as follows: "I am deeply concerned about how the current regime in Rwanda has created a legal framework which aims to silence critics. And one day Rwanda denied any wrongdoing while all the blame on the Dutch side. Besides conspicuous efforts and active involvement of the Dutch authorities to initialize procedures aimed at implementing the extraditions following the respective arrest warrants and indictment documents provided by the Rwandan government," the spokesperson of the Rwanda Prosecution Office, Mr. Alain Bernard Mukurulinda, told the international French radio, RFI, on the 19th of October 2014, that Rwanda had nothing to do with operations undertaken by the Dutch authorities in relation to Rwandan.
Ce n'est pas le gouvernement rwandais ni les institutions ici au Rwanda qui ont été à l'initiative. Il faut que les choses soient claires. Toutes les personnes concernées par cette décision de retrait des documents parce qu'ils sont soupçonnés n'ont rien à voir avec le gouvernement rwandais. Cela ne veut pas dire que si demain les informations soient vérifiées ou qu'il y a de nouvelles informations, que ces personnes ne seront pas poursuivies. Mais aujourd'hui, là on parle de ce dossier, ce n'est pas venu du gouvernement rwandais ou de l'institution judiciaire rwandaise.
Et pour aucune des personnes sur lesquelles les services d'immigration néerlandais ont enquêté, vous avez des dossiers d'accusation?
aucune personne, et d'ailleurs je vous dirais que c'est même ce qui est surprenant, il y a une personne qui a été extradée il y a 3-4 jours, qui était aux Pays-Bas depuis entre 8 ans et 10 ans, qui a été extradée à cause de ces problèmes d'immigration. Elle est rentrée au pays, je pense qu'elle est chez elle ou dans sa famille, et s'il y a des informations la concernant en ce qui concerne ces infractions, elle sera poursuivie, sinon elle va rentrer dans la vie normalement et continuer sa vie ici au Rwanda.
On closer scrutiny, you realize that since 2012 the Rwandan authorities have ruthlessly taken an extra mile in forging baseless accusations against Mr. Joseph Mugenzi, so he could be arrested and extradited to Rwanda. It goes without saying that he is one of the numerous victims of gruesome methods used by the current Rwandan regime to silence critics. Simply because Mr. Mugenzi has been very actively involved in Rwandan opposition political activities in the Netherlands. At several times, he could be seen protesting in front of the Rwandan embassy in The Hague. Alongside, there probably might be another factor worth taking into account, and which may go beyond the Netherlands spectrum. In May 2011, the UK intelligence services had discovered and foiled an assassination plot in London against Mr. Rene Mugenzi, the son of Mr. Joseph Mugenzi. Rene Mugenzi is a very dynamic human rights activist based in the UK, who in addition, is an unsparing critic of the Rwandan regime. In this regard, he has been exposing various human rights abuses by the Rwandan government since 2004. Rene and his family were put under special security protection by the London Metropolitan Police, and London warned Kigali not to dare to do anything like that on the UK soil. The Rwandan government responded by simply saying that they would not want to assassinate Rene Mugenzi, because he is not known to them, therefore they could not be interested at all in him. The then Rwandan Minister of Information, Louise Mushikiwabo, told Al Jazeera at that time that Rene is nobody, no one knows him. This information was relayed by all local Rwandan government media mouthpieces. Then by 2011, how couldn't the Rwanda government spokesperson omit to link Rene Mugenzi's son and father Joseph Mugenzi, if they had a serious grudge against the latter? Couldn't this simply mean that by that time Mr. Joseph Mugenzi's judiciary file was empty? In fact, by that time the assassination plot in London targeting his son, if they had had Joseph Mugenzi in their wanted radar, quite certainly, they would not have missed to mention that. A typical story about the incident would have popped and relayed in many of the Rwandan tabloids and propaganda media as follows. They did not attempt to assassinate Rene, however his father is wanted genocide suspect. In contrast, quite surprisingly, neither government nor media issued any statement making the connections. In light of the previous development, one may wonder whether there is any connection between the failed assassination plot against a son in London and the pursuit of father in the Netherlands. As inconclusive as it might appear at first sight, one may conceive that after the Rwandan authorities failed to take down Rene in London, they probably came up with a genius idea of going after his father in Netherlands. The one who engineered such a plan probably believed such a strategy would discourage, weaken, and deter Rene Mugenzi from carrying out further his human rights work in the UK, which threatened both millions of pounds of support that Rwanda was receiving from the UK government and continuous support at the UN and EU level. And the best quite winning strategy to successfully sully and take down his father was to use forged genocide crimes. 1 year after the botched assassination plot in London, a well-elaborate genocide-related indictment document against Mr. Joseph Mugenzi had been concocted and sent to The Hague. As a consequence, from 2014 onwards, Rene Mugenzi was all of a sudden branded with an odd reference characterization, mostly used by the staunch supporters of Rwandan authority, to tarnish his name and rights activism works. They would now refer to him as the son of a wanted genocide fugitive. Against all odds, Joseph Mugenzi wrestling against the forces conspiring to forcefully extradite him to Rwanda are far from being over in the Netherlands. Beside the above reported cases, there remains many other cases of those already extradited and those fighting extradition in the Netherlands, which we may share with the public in the future. They also present a number of irregularities and are quite informative of the unfair treatments facing the targeted people.
As we reach this stage, you may all have come to appreciate what led us to dubbing this film, how the Netherlands knowingly and actively empowered an oppressor in Rwanda. Knowingly, because Dutch authorities are accurately and timely informed of what's going on in Rwanda. They have access to all kinds of reports, including internal reports, country assessment reports, country political and economic landscape reports, as well as credible human rights related reports, all of which may point out incompetence, lies, concealment, use of terror and both the manipulative and oppressive nature of the Rwandan government, especially when using of the justice system. Based on the previously articulated arguments, it is quite a shame to realize that part of the Dutch taxpayers' money is channeled to funding evil agendas of an oppressive regime. And allegations contained in this documentary are all publicly available for consultation and verification. Knowingly, because Dutch authorities experienced firsthand the quality of the work of the famous Dutch-funded genocide fugitive tracking unity that prepares and sends arrest warrants and indictment documents. Actively, because Dutch authorities reactivated, renewed and implemented a long-term sustainable financial support to institutions that consistently failed to perform according to internationally and locally acceptable standards. Actively, because Dutch authorities actively collaborated to a sustained extradition plan of Rwandans to a justice system that has demonstrated to be a tool of oppression. Along the process, Dutch authorities failed their obligations to protect those fleeing persecutions under the UN Refugee Convention. Empowered an oppressor, Dutch authorities did so by providing consistent financial means to fund oppressive tools disguised as justice and law enforcement institutions, and by extraditing to Rwanda its critics that have been falsely portrayed as criminals. This has created an environment of fear within the Rwandan community in the Netherlands. Elsewhere, many Rwandans have consequently been induced to completely renouncing any involvement in human rights and political related activities, even if this could contribute to building healthy communities in the long run. In an indirect way, Dutch authorities have helped achieve an oppressive Rwandan regime's wish of shutting down all opposition critical voices residing in the Netherlands. As far as Rwanda does not abide by internationally accepted democratic governance standards, such as respect of human rights, and allow independent judicial institutions, the Netherlands should put an end to its support to non-performing sectors such as the judiciary and law enforcement sector. Because the provided support is used among other activities to extradite innocent people by way of false accusations used by the Rwandan government to fool Dutch authorities. By failing to do so, then the Dutch authorities should come clean and stop misleading its people and world. They should promptly initiate the process of amending Article 1 of its constitution, where it states, "All who are in the Netherlands are treated equally in equal cases. Discrimination on the grounds of religion, belief, political opinion, race, sex, or any other ground is not allowed." By changing it into, "All who are in the Netherlands except Rwandans with arrest warrants from Kigali are treated equally in equal cases. Discrimination on the grounds of religion, belief, political opinion, race, sex, or any other ground is not allowed." In light of the present film revelations, we hope to have shed some light on what's going on in the shadows of the Netherlands governments with regards to collaboration with Rwandan judiciary authorities. The world, Dutch taxpayers and ourselves shall sit and observe what path the Netherlands authorities will eventually choose to take. In our opinion, it should not be a hard decision to make. Because people in senior decision-making positions can't be said to be completely ignorant of what's at stake here. As a matter of fact, in one of the reports of the Embassy of the Netherlands in Rwanda, on the section highlighting the key concerns needing to be addressed, the following observation was made. Restrictions on freedom of speech and political space is the weak spot within an overall effective government. This is in a polished definition of an oppressive regime. Before the end, may I implore all of you for a 1 minute of silence in remembering all Rwandans that have been oppressed using institutions that have been empowered by Dutch taxpayers' money. A 1 minute of silence for Rwandans who have been extradited to Rwanda to face the ordeal of a pitiless and atrocious injustice system which apply dreadful treatments. A 1 minute of silence for members of their families that are in the Netherlands who most likely may never see them again. And finally, a 1 minute of silence for the Rwandan community in the Netherlands, who live in constant fear of being the next potential victims of the Kigali oppressive government, whose evil schemes wouldn't ultimately materialize without the collusion of the Dutch government they sought protection from. All that can't be achieved without the Dutch people's tax money, and their government continuing to turn a blind eye to human rights abuses of the Rwandan government.